Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. Welcome. I'm here on this very nice, cool day in the summer here in Utah, and it's very enjoyable. I wanted to talk about anger because I think it's an emotion that is so incredibly ubiquitous and powerful, and yet I believe is often misunderstood, even by me, where I misunderstand what the implications and intentions of anger actually are. Now, I find myself to actually be fairly angry, and I would say actually very angry about certain things. And I wouldn't categorize myself as an angry young man, given that even though that tradition exists, I try to take a more methodical kind of approach with my anger. I try to make it to where I don't let anger be the only emotion that I feel. But that said, the anger is definitely there. And it comes from a lot of different sources that I wish that I could have more say in. So, for instance, I work, and in the workforce at various places I've been, it's actually been pretty brutal. I've kind of felt that there's a lot of things that are out of my control about it, where maybe you have difficult time with bosses, maybe you have difficult time with coworkers, maybe you have a difficult time even figuring out what you want to do. But I feel like it's definitely there, where I don't like the way that I'm treated. And that's a bigger theme here, which is that in my life, I feel like I have not always been treated well. And that leads to a lot of problems. And it does upset me, I will be honest. It makes me feel as though I don't have any choices. I get angry at the way that I'm treated by people out in public for whatever reason, where they might be a little bit more judgmental and harsh with me, even as I'm working to make myself presentable, and being able to understand what it is that makes people social. But I get really confused about anger as an emotion, because certainly in the worst cases it can lead to violence, a kind of even fabricated, manufactured violence, which can be an incredibly tough thing, but which is something that I think is there. It's very interesting in our culture because we have this kind of religious passivity where we can't be angry, we can't have a personality, we can't feel what we feel. And yet it's opposed with this kind of definitely non-religious view where any kind of violence is actually a good thing. It's actually encouraged. And the more that I think about it, the more that I admit that I don't really understand how to feel about anger, because there's not really a very robust kind of discussion about why people feel what they feel. And so for me, when I'm thinking about my own anger and I'm thinking about my own frustrations, I'm thinking about how I don't like the way that I'm treated in many circumstances, and I think about how unfair life actually is, it can be easy to get consumed by the anger and by those emotions. Now, I'm lucky enough to where I have some outlets to be able to deal with anger in a more constructive way. They do call that sublimation, and I can do that through music, both through listening and playing music. But I can also do it through my writing, of course. I can do it through YouTube, where I can express my emotions. I've got poetry. I've got all of these things that help me figure things out. And I think it does it in a healthy way. But sometimes that anger is just all there. That's all that there is. Not in the sense that that's all that I feel quite literally, because I don't. I have a rich spectrum of emotions. But it's definitely important to acknowledge that that anger is just so powerful, and that it is pervasive, and that it does affect our lives. And so in my mind, I keep thinking, what is going to be a good way of acknowledging what I feel? Now, yesterday was very interesting because I was getting ready to go to work to deal with the day in and day out of life and all of the things that we deal with all the time. And there was a brief period where I cried. I cried at injustice. I cried from the pain that I feel from some of my negative experiences. You know, the break-in is definitely something that I think about a lot when that happened recently and how that impacted me. But I guess what I would say is that what's important here is that the anger is there, and I could finally acknowledge that. It was like a puzzle fitting together finally, where I was able to acknowledge what I feel. And while I would acknowledge that anger is definitely not the only emotion that I feel, like I said, I definitely have a rich spectrum of emotions, it still feels as though I haven't always acknowledged that I feel this way. And it's interesting that it became sadness, that the anger was very strong and yet it was just sadness. And I don't always know what to do with that, right? Especially since I'm just figuring this out in real time, where the real emotion that I thought I was feeling was anger, but it was actually just complete sadness. Sadness at the injustice of the world, not even just stuff that happens to me, but to others, where we live in an unfair system. And I just had to admit, I don't know why I feel all of these things. But it was very helpful to acknowledge, yes, I do feel anger. And even if it is coming across more as sadness, that anger is definitely there. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that sometimes. Like I said, we don't really talk about why we experience anger, why people suffer when they don't need to, why there's injustice in the world, why unfair things happen, why horrible things happen, terrifying things. But it doesn't stop them from happening. And so what I think we need to do is try to have a more robust conversation about anger, because what I hope that we can figure out is what to do with those emotions. I personally think it's very wise to sublimate the emotions and to curb them in a healthy way. But we live in a world that doesn't believe in that. We live in a world that is very much war hungry and that wants to fight. And whether the violence is societal or individual and personal. And I get it to a degree. You know, the world is definitely an ugly place sometimes, and it's all, groups pitted against groups and survival, the survival mode we get in. But I just think more and more about how I, for myself, like that I'm able to sublimate my anger through my art, because I think it's very productive, and I think sometimes it allows me to take the high road. But that isn't the way that the world is always going to be. And so it seems to me that that anger is always going to be there in the world. And I just think we should talk about it more. I guess for me personally, I can admit that I don't always know what to do with those feelings, and I can be just as guilty of any of these things that I'm talking about. But I do like the idea of taking the high road with such emotions and finding ways of giving them life and expression while also doing it in a way that doesn't make things harder than they already are. And so the more we're able to have a discussion about what that anger means and what the anger represents, I think the easier time we have being able to figure out what we need to do. And so there definitely is a place for angry emotions. I think music is definitely a good place for that. But there is also a way in which I, at least for myself, hope that we can continue to process it, continue to process those feelings of hurt and sadness that underlie it. And I think if we're able to do that, we'll be able to process it in a way that is a lot easier and a lot more beneficial. That's just me. Like I said, I think there's a lot to this conversation, but I think that's one of the biggest things. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope you watch my videos. I hope you check out my books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.